The announcement of Star Wars Zero Company generated a lot of excitement for some people, i.e. me, but there have also been some more negative takes out there, so I wanted to take some time to talk about the game and its reception so far, both the positive and the negative, breaking that into two major categories. Complaints about what the game is, and about what the game is not. First, let's talk about what the game isn't, which involves a lot more talking about other Star Wars games than Zero Company itself. While some people are happy to get essentially a Star Wars XCOM experience, there is a lot of disappointment that this game isn't something else entirely, whether that's an RTS for strategy fans who have been waiting for something more like Empire at War for almost 20 years now, or even Battlefront fans who are upset that this is being made instead of Battlefront 3, some of which you can see in the screenshot of reactions taken by my friend Elliot over on the Battlefront Updates channel. Ultimately, I think this paints Star Wars gaming as a kind of zero-sum game, where if one type of game gets made, it means another kind can't. And I understand the disappointment of seeing a new game that isn't quite what you wanted, but while there are some limitations in the bandwidth that Lucasfilm Games has, I don't think you can point to Zero Company as being the reason Empire at War 2 or Battlefront 3 aren't happening, any more than you could point to Star Wars Squadrons as being the reason for that a few years ago. This is a studio that specializes in this kind of game and has people that are passionate about this kind of game. Like Squadrons, it seems like it is a passion project, and I think that is a good sign for the game. We've had quite a few rumored or even announced games over the last few years, particularly since the license was no longer exclusively held by EA, but even before then across multiple genres, from titles that did release like the Jedi games, Outlaws, Hunters, and Squadrons, to the Respawn shooter which was announced alongside the first hints of Zero Company itself in I think 2023. Then you have the rumored Creative Assembly RTS, Eclipse, and several others. So clearly there's room for a lot of genres here, and Zero Company wasn't automatically locking anything out of being made. The problem seems to be actually making progress on and releasing these games. Zero Company stands out because it's one of the few games to actually get somewhere, and I think that's where the real frustration lies. But I do hope less of this frustration gets taken out in the direction of BitReactor. Unfortunately, it seems less and less like Petroglyph will ever get the chance to make Empire at War 2, but we do at least have that rumored Creative Assembly game. The problem is, who knows if that will ever actually get anywhere, assuming it's real. On the Battlefront side, even if a Battlefront game was announced this week at Celebration, for example, it likely wouldn't come out until 2027 if not later, which would put the time between Battlefront 2 and 3, or Battlefront 1, 3, or whatever it would be called, longer than the gap between the original Battlefront 2 and the EA Battlefront 1, and that's without even including Renegade and Elite Squadron, which closed that gap considerably. Instead, the only multiplayer shooter to release recently was Star Wars Hunters, which had one of the weirdest launches I've seen, contributing to a very messy announcement that it's shutting down, which is kind of a shame because I actually do enjoy the game, although it doesn't really hold up to other games like Marvel Rivals, which have also released fairly recently, and which set a much higher bar for these kind of franchised arena shooters. So there's clearly an appetite for good Star Wars or other franchised games of a variety of genres. But while part of the failing here does come down to licensing decisions and costs, with many companies, EA included, turning away from licensed properties to focus on their own cheaper IP, which is undoubtedly part of the reason that Respawn's shooter was cancelled, the game development landscape in general is more of a hellscape right now. I know a few people in game development, and almost all of them have been laid off recently. Star Wars games aren't exempt from that, but because of all those extra licensing costs, they probably also suffer from it even more, and they'd be one of the first things to axe if a company is looking for some short-term cost savings. Alternatively, they might keep a game that they have no intention of actually making on the slate just so they can attract more investment dollars. And I definitely don't mean the KOTOR remake having these quarterly announcements that it's definitely still in existence, or Star Wars Eclipse. I would definitely not allege either of those aren't actually in production. And it doesn't help that both games and movies tend to be in a similar place for Star Wars right now, with both being announced regularly with no follow-up for years. Meanwhile, even just within Disney, Marvel Rivals has been pretty well received, as well as Midnight Suns a couple years ago, which is kind of Marvel's Zero Company. And while reception of the MCU as a whole may be a different issue, it's undeniable that those movies are in fact releasing. I think the plan that Lucasfilm Games had talked about before was having a bigger and smaller title releasing every year, and it just feels like we're not anywhere close to that yet. But let's move on to what the game is. We'll have far more information even just later this week on that, so I won't run too far into speculation land. Instead, I want to focus on one of the things we do know and the reaction to that, the Clone Wars setting. It seems like right now, reaction to any of the three possible settings would get some amount of negative reactions. There's a bit of fatigue when it comes to the original trilogy era, given that basically every game we've had in the last decade has been set in that period, either exclusively or alongside the other two trilogy settings in the case of the Battlefront games. The Clone Wars has this feeling attached to it as well, but I don't think that there's much to back that up. Game-wise, it's only really been present alongside the original trilogy and sometimes the sequel trilogy. Although it's certainly true that there has been a significant amount of focus in the shows on either the Clone Wars or the just after Clone Wars period, or at least for Clone Wars nostalgia in shows that aren't actually set in the Clone Wars. But despite the generally improved public image the era has, there are still a lot of particularly older fans who dislike the era. But for the third possible era, when you even say the word sequels, there's a chunk of people who will automatically begin frothing at the mouth. Really, I think any of the three movie eras would work on a mechanical level, but I actually think the Clone Wars are the best period to go into for the game for a few reasons. Firstly, I don't think the sequel trilogy was actually going to be an option, because there seems to be a desire to let the movies take the lead in telling the next parts of that story, so any developer's hands would probably be tied in just how much they could actually do. Most importantly though, I think as a game with a genre that has less mass appeal, like turn-based tactical games, I think the time period chosen needs to have the broadest appeal possible, which right now I do think means the Clone Wars, especially when the last 4 games have also been Galactic Civil War, contributing to a bit of that fatigue. Maybe I'm misassessing the relative appeal of the OT versus PT for people who may actually be considering buying the game, but the PT also has a wide variety of possible enemy and ally types, and it's the easiest to throw Jedi in without raising any eyebrows, and I think people do like to see Jedi in Star Wars stuff. A small-scale guerrilla campaign probably fits the Rebellion era better, but there's always the possibility of sequels if the game does well. That's going to do it for now though. I'll be covering the game as more information comes out, so make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more if you're interested. But until then, let me know what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching.